Hi everyone, this is Nick from NXE Plants. Today I'm going to be going through this great thread that Kylie Rogers started in Anthurium Addicts. I know Charmaine did a very similar video to this recently and I definitely recommend you check it out. It was great. So obviously I don't want to pretend this is original. So we're going to be going through this thread and reacting to some people's beginner plant advice. Sorry, no, that's not quite right. What is the worst advice you've gotten growing anthuriums? And then they have a second thread that Sam created in a different group called Advanced Anthurium Addicts, and I'm also going to go through that one. And that is like a similar anthurium care advice thread. So I figured we'd go through these together and sort of enjoy what people had to say. First one we have is cutting your plants helps you make your money back the fastest. So I think this is going to be specifically advice for anthurium because obviously we're not all here propagating our monstera and our philodendron by seed. I know some of you are because you're talented enough to grow them that size indoors. I'm not. But I think specifically for anthurium, I'd probably tend to agree. If you're willing to commit to growing a plant out and breeding with it, you could definitely make your more money if that's what you're into. But I know a lot of people, especially when you're starting out, they like to cut the plant when they get it, grow that out and try to get back what they paid for it. So I'm not gonna say that's a terrible idea. I just think a lot of times, especially if you take a greedy cut, you end up losing the cut and often the mother plant as well. So I'm kind of a big fan these days of letting my plants grow out a fair amount before I cut them. Oh, and another thing when it comes to whether or not you decide to cut your plant or not, one, I like to think about what is the purpose of this plant. If it's if you bought a two Dressleri to make your own F1 Dressleri, you're going to be better off just growing those plants out. You're going to set them back so much by cutting them. And if your goal is these F1 offspring, then work towards your goal, and you'll have a better time selling the seedlings than you will one or two cuttings off your Dressleri. But if it's something like a Rhodolanthianum, where hybrids are not really the easiest, it might make sense to take a prop to grow out. But again, I always caution cutting, especially small plants. I know sometimes it works out, and even if it's more times than not. But when you're dealing with these plants that are hard to replace, or they're irreplaceable because they're unique to you, cutting them when they're small is often a very needless risk when you can just grow them to a large size and they'll often offset. What plant am I going to show?
You could show the Rhoda.
Well, I'll just pull this guy. I mean, here's an example of a plant I got pretty recently, and I did actually cut when I got it. So I did cut it when it was small. This is a PAP RA6. So, I mean, first off, it's a PAP. I'm always going to be a little bit crazier when it comes to PAPs, just because they respond so well to being cut, usually. However, from the prop of this, I removed it from the chunk it came off of a little bit prematurely, and I nearly killed the top cut. So the prop I took was nearly worthless because I almost killed it. But the main plant was fine in this case. Really think about what it is you're cutting and what your goals are for it before you potentially set yourself back a long time. Oh, I know the perfect example for this. My King of Spades, on an up pot I propped it. I think I set myself back 6 months to a year on flowering that plant. I still have yet to get a successful flower. It's tried. That's a different story. But I definitely think I would have had flowers this grow season had I not cut it. So there's that. And I cut it to sell up a single cutting. I didn't even sell them. I traded them to my friends. So for that, I don't really mind it. But if I'd been trying to make money and I sold those King of Spades at market price, I would have been far better off getting some King of Spades pollen and putting it on other plants, or pollinating the King of Spades and making hybrids, if my goal was money. This comment is so good because it's so true. They all grow really slow. It takes years for them to get big, so you don't need to worry about them outgrowing your space for a long time. These things, especially if you get a cabinet for your seedlings, at least that's how we started. We had a Rudsta, and I think that lasted all of a few months before our little seedlings and props and whatnot exploded out of that cabinet. And Corbin convinced me to get a grow tent, so that's when we got this 4x4 grow tent, and ever since that, I haven't looked back. The tent is just so wonderful for growing. So yeah, I totally agree. These things will take off, especially by the time you have 20 or 30 of these little seedlings. Before you know it, you'll have no space. Next comment, they're just like any other species. And then the person said, no, they aren't. lying ass. You guys are gonna hate me. I think they're easier than philodendrons. I think they're easier than pothos. Don't hate me. I mean, obviously species. I'm not talking about something like a debilis, but you know, your paps, your crystallinums, your red crystals, whatever. I think they're some of the easiest houseplants I've cared for. I even moved some Anthurium to ambient recently, and no fuss. I think, yeah, what plant stressed the most? I think it was like an escaleto or something that stressed the most on the ambient acclimation. The Anthurium didn't even flinch. I'm going to be experimenting more with that, so that'll be a future video, but I don't know, it feels like once you can figure out how to keep them perfectly moist all the time, they become pretty hardy. Oh god. This one from the author of the post. Even if you have mite damage, if you don't see mites, it's not mites, so don't worry. If you see anything that even looks remotely like mite damage, it's mites. You assume you have mites. Like I'd say 99% of the time you can't see them until you have a pretty serious infestation. So if you're seeing, like if that little voice in your head is saying, that looks like it could be mite damage, treat the plants, treat their neighbors, assume you have mites and you just can't see them yet because they can be so dang tiny. And the damage will show up before the mites are visible. Oh, and fun fact, the mites can continue hatching out of their eggs for 3 months after you had like visible adults. So assume you've got a treat for like many, many months after you see the mites. And that's just like the ballpark I found from research because I was looking up how long I have to, keep up the insecticide treatment or miticide treatment in order to make sure that the outbreak never returns. But yeah, if you see mite damage, it's always mites, it's mites. And if you're ever quarantining a plant for mites, it takes more than 3 months of quarantine. Jay Crane said that the queen is perfect for beginner. Queen was probably I think the queen was one of the Anthuriums I started with. That queen is dead. Yeah, I'd say don't fear it too much if you can care for other Anthurium, but I probably wouldn't start with a queen. They can be a bit temperamental if you aren't... Oh my gosh, I should pull down the queen so I can show it off to you guys. That way you can take I have proof that I can grow a queen big. My queen is literally too big to fit in frame, but there you go. I can hold it out here so it looks really big like the Instagrammers. I was gonna say my advice for the queen is don't let it dry out. When they get big, they're a lot less temperamental, I will say that. But if you see on this guy, this little bit of coloring here and the tip, that's from drying out. Yeah, my advice for the queen is lots and lots of light. And this leaf stunted a little bit because it dried out what was emerging. But my advice for growing the queens would be a lot of light. They definitely take way more light than your average velvet leafed Anthurium. Don't let it dry out and give it a heavy feed. They size up pretty quickly when they're happy like that. So definitely, like once you've got your Anthurium, like I'd say your Anthurium soil mix of choice figured out, I think you're ready to try out a queen. Oh, also cooler temperatures. They don't need it, but it can be beneficial. Okay, they like their roots wet/damp all the time. Thank you for killing a few of mine. Yeah, they do want to be wet and damp all the time. I'm going to disagree with this person. The rest of that is wet but not anaerobic, and that's a big difference. So I think that's the only part I disagree with. Like they want to be wet, but they need to be airy at the same time. So there's a few ways to do that. If you don't have good airflow to the pot, you're going to need to let it go a little bit drier than if you do have good airflow in the pot. So that's the balancing act. You got to push it a little bit further. Worst advice I ever got. Get that now while it's 10K and you can prop/sell while the price is still high. Here I'm going to be a little bit spicy. If the average plant person, if you're able to purchase the plant on the open market, it's not that rare. And it's probably not worth 10K. And you're probably at the tail end of those first round of plants that went out. So I'd be very careful. I think a good example of this, it's not Anthurium, but has been those Florida Beauty variegated hybrids coming out. At least here in Canada, I mean, I feel like they started off like $1,000 a mid-cut, and now it's a few $100 for a very cute grown out plant. And I feel like that happened in a matter of 6 to 12 months. So if you are buying these very expensive plants, you're purchasing time for propagation. That's the way you have to think about it. And if you're not like competent at quickly multiplying them, and especially with variegated plants, if you don't start with good stock, like you can very quickly just lose that investment, if you want to call it that. Yeah, and don't spend 10K on a plant unless you'd be willing to go to a casino and burn 10K on nothing, because plants die. So, you know, if that's like, don't spend 10K on plants unless you have multiples of 10K for fun, which is just, I feel like such a small. They need high humidity. I'm assuming this person meant more than 70%. Seems to be true for seedlings, but not maturity. I totally agree. I think a good number of them, a good number of the Anthurium you'd want to, or that we enjoy growing in this hobby, are fully capable of being acclimated to room conditions that, you know, you and I would be comfortable being in. You know, there's obviously exceptions, but I'm not going to list them because I feel like if the plant is very sensitive and crispy, it's probably not a candidate for ambient. But if you've got a plant looking very lush and happy in your grow tent, you might be able to experiment with pushing it out of the tent. I'm definitely something I'm working on playing with. I think going forward is going to be growing more and more things in ambient. Okay, next one. Put it in pon right away. Oh my gosh, it jumped. Yeah, put it in pon right away. They only like pon, all of them, can't mess it up. I don't really grow with Lechuza. There's so many competent growers who've had great success with it. But I think it's, you know, any absolute advice is never going to be good. It's always going to be do what works for you in your conditions with your ability to care. Like, that's the caveat on everything. So yeah, like if it works in your mix, don't feel the pressure to try pon or tree fern or whatever. But I will say I've definitely had some plants that just did not like the inorganic media. It totally could, it's totally like specimen dependent even. It's not even like something I'd get blanket apply to a species across the board. This comment was like kind of related to what we said earlier. You just need a cabinet, and then they responded. Their thing was like, no, I need a 100-foot commercial greenhouse, and in about 12 months you need to go from a cabinet to a commercial greenhouse. I can't disagree, especially when you start breeding. I feel like give me a year and I could be in a greenhouse surrounded by 1 million of my own seedlings if I wanted to be. I mean, if I could, let's be real. Obviously I want to. Oh, so lots of these comments are about space. I think the solution to being out of space is becoming ruthless. You gotta be ruthless. If the plant isn't making you happy, if it's not growing well, if it doesn't have, like, if you don't have future plans for it, maybe if you bought a batch of 3 and one of them isn't really growing well compared to the rest, these are the sort of plants that you should be, you know, whether that's composting or selling. But I mean, selling runts is never like something I like to do. I think like if you can eliminate the plants from your collection that aren't making you happy, you'll enjoy the ones you have a lot more. Oh gosh. Then there's someone commenting about when they first got into the Anthurium and they were getting like imports from Equigenera. I think we've all killed our fair share of those plants before we knew what we were doing. I think now, once you understand how to handle an import, it becomes a lot easier. And I haven't really had too many casualties since, unless I'm trying to import something from very high elevation cloud forests. Then there's a good chance I might kill it. But I think my advice for imports, if you're new to this, is I like some sort of kelp hormone. I use Super Thrive in filter water, and then when I get the fresh import, I like to soak it for a few hours, sometimes overnight if it's looking a little unhappy. And if it's low elevation and is tolerant of heat, I put it on a heat mat in the water. If it's from high elevation, it's a cloud forest species, or it's one that's more sensitive to heat, like a Cunha, like a Debilis, like a Splendidum, avoid the heat mats. So this is where like you got to have a bunch of knowledge about how this plant grows in nature. If it's rheophytic or cloud forest, it needs to avoid heat. If it's low elevation, it doesn't mention anything about it growing in rivers or near rivers and streams. You can probably experiment with upping the heat. But again, this is the sort of thing I would do during the day while you're home. So you can check on it every few hours, because it can really just go like overnight. Your plant can go from lush to cooked spinach. But yeah, Super Thrive in water for a few hours. Very heavily prune the roots. Any of those secondary or tertiary roots, they're going to rot. At least in my experience, they don't really survive the re-rooting phase. And most of the time the plant will just root from up higher, from the fresh growth. So there's really no point in keeping them beyond what the plant needs to stay hydrated. And that comes to the second thing, which is keep it in as close to 100% humidity as you can give it. I personally like a bin, just like a closed bin, no fan, no nothing complicated. And that way the plants don't really have to put much effort into keeping themselves plump. Yeah. Import roots in general are trash because they've been chemically treated. They're usually just in the process of dying slowly. Those big ones will often hang around and just slowly rot back, but you got to think of them as just to keep the plant hydrated while it pushes new roots from up high. Anthuriums are easy. Yes, they are easy. I agree. And even though this person said it sarcastically. This person doesn't like putting a layer of lac at the bottom. I personally like the layer of lac at the bottom. I think it does a good job keeping the roots from winding aggressively down there, and I also think it stops that little swampy accumulation you get down towards the bottom of the pot. I think like I add a layer of leca to literally all of my pots, no matter what I'm doing. In these big net ones, it's nice because it keeps the soil from dropping out of the bottom. Even in these white square ones that don't have that issue, I do add the layer of leca, and that's just, like I said, to prevent that like swampy accumulation, and to prevent the roots from spiraling super tightly at the bottom there. Another person said, any absolute advice, like you have to, you can only, I totally agree. Oh, then the second part, whole no drainage is a death sentence. Ooh, that's hard. I almost want to agree, but again, there's definitely applications for no drainage, and I do still keep some plants in it. I especially like it for props or things I'm trying to root with that don't have much or any root to begin with. So like when I got that King of Spades rehab video, I put it into a 32 ounce like food storage container with a layer of leca and pon. I'm gonna grab it and show you. So this is, I'm hoping the roots show nicely. You can see from that YouTube video, this thing is now pretty rooted in here. So this is definitely the point at which I would transfer something out of no drainage. If it's, you know, a sensitive anthurium. I think there's like, what am I keeping? I fertilize a lot, and the danger with no drainage is you can't flush it, and you can have quite a bit of accumulation because these plants will be, you know, emptying the reservoir over and over again, sometimes, you know, in the span of a few days to a week. So if you keep adding fertilizer on, you know, a weekly basis, you can end up burning the plants. So usually what I would do when I'm using no drainage is it's plants I'm not fertilizing much. So like this is something I haven't fertilized because it doesn't have new active growth. Beyond, I did fertilize it the first time I planted it in order to get some rooting hormone and nutrients into it, but after that I usually let it sit until I'm seeing active growth. And that's just because I'm worried about nutrient accumulation. In the substrate, it's in my pon, which has the fluval, so that's providing the plant with everything except for nitrogen in a very like gentle little amounts, which works great. And here's another plant I have in no drainage. This is a red crystal Self. Don't know if the red's going to show, but I have it in here because I'm taking it to a sale soon. So I took it out of the little net pot setup and put it into here so it could grow a bigger root system before going off to a new home. Then here's an example of what happens if a plant stays in the no drainage for too long. So I got a little bit fried. I really should give this thing a new home so the roots can breathe a little bit better, but I can't be bothered. So here's a good example of how to do it right and an example of me doing it wrong. So just in my experience, I like to keep things in a little bit of an airier situation, and I find it easier. The way I do this successfully is I have to let it dry out, and I have to keep track of how frequently I'm fertilizing. So that's just why I personally prefer the net pot with drainage setup. It's just a little bit easier for me to keep up with. Yeah, obviously, if no drainage works for you, if you love the glass vessel parfait style of potting and your plants are happy and healthy, then like power to you. It's all about doing what works for you. Oh, here's another good one. Don't up pot your plant with an emergent or after shipping, it'll stress it out too much. I generally don't repot plants with emergent leaves. I will if it's small or if it's a very hardy plant. And that just comes down to personal experience. What's hardy for me might not be hardy for you, so I would never want to be like, oh, if you have a Carla, repot it whenever, emergent doesn't matter. What else? Wait. And after shipping, oh my, I repot every plant after shipping. I don't trust anyone's mix other than my own. I want to see the roots. Doesn't matter how good the plant looks, doesn't matter where it comes from. As soon as it comes in my house, it's being cleaned down bare root. It's going to be treated for pests, it's going to be sprayed, it's going to be washed, and then it's going to go in my mix. I'm not bringing other people's pon, other people's aeroid mix, none of that's coming in. It's just a way to reduce the pest pressure on your collection, and it's ultimately your care, so you should be putting the plant that you just spent your money on into the thing you're most comfortable with caring for. Here we have a plant that I repotted with an emergent leaf recently. So this is the emergent, and then right here is the previous leaf. So you can see that I did stunt this leaf quite a bit, and that's just the consequence of repotting while the plant has an emergent leaf. It's not gonna, like, in this case, there's no harm, no foul. The thing you have to worry about, and I think what more determines when I repot, is how the roots are looking. If I have a very fluffy, fresh root system that hasn't spiraled the pot, isn't stuck to itself, and I can just set it in a new setup without really disturbing it or having to play or maneuver the roots very much, I think that is a lot less stressful than a lot of other repots can be. So it's all about knowing your plants and what your comfort level is. I'm just marveling at the texture on the petioles. It's always so eye-catching with this plant. And here is my last example of what I like to keep in no drainage, and that's when I take something like this Hoya prop. I'll just take the fresh cutting and stick it right into my pond mix, and I've had pretty good success both rooting and starting Hoya that way. In, again, no drainage. So I do make use of no drainage occasionally. It's just not my preference, obviously, because I have to keep up on watering it like it's a normal plant. Here's a good piece of bad advice. Don't pot your plant bigger than one size more than the root ball. So I think that means, like, if it's in a 4-inch pot, don't go bigger than a 5-inch pot. Ignore that. If you can keep the mix appropriately moist, then you can pot it in any size you want. I could pot a seedling in this 12-inch net pot bucket setup, and I have, with complete and total success. And that's just because with a wick setup, it stays perfectly moist. So I don't have to worry about keeping on top of watering such a large setup without, overwatering the bottom where the long roots will be, while the top dries out, killing the new fresh roots. So again, just any of this plant advice, can be negated with modifications to the care. Here's a funny one. This person said, the advice I gave myself was, no worries, I'll remember exactly what the tiny complex hybrid cross seed was and who it came from when I need to. And then me, hundreds of Anthuriums later, being very confused. Yeah, you definitely gotta label them. When they're small, they look identical. And if you don't keep on top of labeling, a lot of, especially complex hybrids, can look very, I don't want to say it's similar, but if you don't write it down, is this a PAP BVEP or is this a BVEP PAP, right? Label. It said, anything with strict substrate mix or best recipe, not taking into consideration the size of the pot, the plant, the species, and relative humidity. I definitely agree that your substrate should be dictated by your environment. However, I use the same tree fern and pond mix in ambient that I do in a bin, that I do in a tent, and the plants are happy in all three. I don't change the recipe either between things. I think that's totally a way to grow. I prefer to standardize based off of what the plants are showing me. If anyone talking about ambient without giving what their room resting humidity is minus 20%, 27% in the dead of winter and 40% when it's not raining outside. Ambient to me means within the 20 to 60% humidity range. If I'm ever saying ambient again in the future, I live in Canada. I run a heater 6 to 8 months of the year. So I definitely, my humidity can get very low. And like I said, I think the main thing I noticed from low humidity is spider mites more than... This person said, Anthuriums require strong or bright indirect light to grow, and that they now grow their Anthurium under 80% shade cloth. From when I started out to now, the amount I've reduced the the light I give my Anthurium is crazy. I feel like I used to have them like this far from a 25 watt, those 25 watt Barina bars, and now I've got them, you know, a foot, 2 feet back from 10 watt bars. They really like, they require a shockingly little amount of light. Like I swear I'll put one under a plant, like there's a grow light here, I'll have a plant like hiding here under one of the leaves and it'll be growing just as fast as if it was next to the grow light. They are crazy good at growing in the dark, especially like the seeds and seedlings. They can grow in like under your shelf. It's insane. Some of them obviously want lots of light. Don't take when I'm not speaking in absolutes. These dark velvet ones is mostly what I'm referring to when I say they can tolerate ridiculously low light. Pendant anthuriums, they will rot their roots. Yeah, this person's, you have to have a grow tent, high temp, humidity, etc. for anthurium to do well. I think you can grow, like I said, the vast majority of the ones people like to hold and collect in the hobby, and a lot of the hybrids very, very easily in an ambient setup. It's obviously just going to require care modifications if you're basing your care off of tent growing. This one, it's a cheap hobby. It's definitely not a cheap hobby. I think one of the good things about this hobby is you can offset your costs through, you know, breeding or propagation, but it's certainly not a cheap hobby. All those rotten roots are just food for the plant. Leave it there. That is a terrible idea. Debilis isn't too hard to care for. I actually agree. Debilis is not too hard to care for. I like to bring it out just to taunt, just a little bit. I think the Debilis is as hard to care for as you make it. I'm actually going to experiment with trying to grow Debilis in ambient soon. First, we're going to master growing it in the tent, because right now I'm at the point where it's not crisping at all. So I think I'm ready for a little bit of a challenge. Here's my cutie Debilis. You can see the oldest leaf. This leaf came out while it was importing. You can see no crisping. And I did this leaf in my care again, no crisping. Then this leaf, no crisping. And most recently this leaf, and now actually has another leaf on the way. And I think this guy's in my pond. The plant is just pretty happy, chugging along. I think this is the kind of plant that just, it can never be let to dry out, if I had to guess. And so far I have not let it, you know, dry out. And the results have been pretty good. So I think it's fun to have plants like this that challenge you and force you to understand the plant a little bit better before you can have success growing it. Yeah, and then the second part of this comment is what they omitted in that sentence is that you'd be taking care of a bare stump its whole life. You know, I'm not taking care of a bare stump. Worst advice I ever got was you should get into Anthurium. I think that is actually the best advice. Anthurium are wonderful, and it's such a treat being able to you know, just essentially breed your own ideal Anthurium if you want. You can really just do about whatever you want with these things. It's pretty crazy. I think that's just such a fun aspect that you rarely get to explore so easily in the plant hobby. Okay, if the inflow produced pollen, it wasn't successful. That's rubbish. Don't bother pollinating circus peanuts, ace, or queen of hearts. They are sterile. It's from the Scott Cohen. Yeah, he's totally right. You should definitely pollinate them. There are lots of crosses from all of those. And I think like any plant that's considered sterile is just waiting to be proven wrong. And then under it, it talks about the rhodo. The rhodo, it does suck pollinating the rhodo because you're probably going to get berries. You're just not going to get seeds. But there's always that small chance that you do get seeds from, you know, any of these ones. So definitely if you want a hybrid, try it. The worst thing that happens is nothing. And especially on these plants that are they're not very good at being mothers. Their receptive inflows are essentially wasted, so you may as well try with you know, spare pollen, because you always have way more pollen than flowers once your plants are, you know, online and producing, you know, several vials worth of pollen per inflow. Gatekeeping Anthurium is a good way to stay at the top, and then don't sell cuttings because you're hurting the market value of the plants. I mean, like, obviously you can gatekeep Anthurium all you want, and there's always going to be gatekeeping in every hobby, but I feel like in this plant hobby there's so many good deals all the time, and there's so many wonderful people who want to do trades and whatnot, that there are certainly plants that are very, very gate kept. I don't even know if I want to say gate kept so much as it's just a very beautiful plant that there's super few of, It might be hard to prop or whatever. And the people who have them, they're under no obligation to prop their very precious plant. Like, that's like all I think where I'm going to leave it. Like, no one is under the obligation to prop their plant. And while it may come across as gatekeeping, a lot of these plants might die or take years to recover from a prop. Especially the more aesthetically interesting ones. They're often horribly inbred and very fragile. They might be beautiful, but it can be very nerve-wracking propping, a plant that is ostensibly worth tens of thousands of dollars. And not really, but in this hobby, sure, we can say that. To sell one cutting when you can self it, when you can breed with it, and have, even potentially stronger offspring with the characteristic of the mother that you're looking for. Don't sell cuttings because you're hurting the market value of the plants. Do what you want. It's your plants, it's your money. If you want to buy a $500 plant, chop it into 3 pieces and sell them for $250 a piece, go for it. That's a way to make $250 quickly. Just know there's only so many plants you can do that to, and if you're not, breeding or growing these plants out, you're not really adding value. You're just sort of quickly pulling it out. Like, I'm not going to criticize anyone who does that. I think it's part of the hobby. Oh, here's a good one. You have to let propagations callus over for a day before putting them in water or potting medium. I do sometimes like to let propagations callus. Usually not in room humidity. I usually have them callus something more in the tent. If it's a plant that likes to rot a lot, usually what I do instead is situate the node up above the substrate and just have the root going down. That way there's good airflow all around it. Okay, I think that is pretty much it in the Anthurium addicts thread. So now I'm going to go to the other group thread and just pull through the last few things. So this thread is about what defines being a better grower. So I've been growing, I'm going to read this verbatim, I'm also going to post it up. I've been growing Anthurium for 3 or so years now, not nearly as long as some people here. Something I've always heard is how some people are better growers than others. Like, what defines a better grower? Here, I think this is a good comment from Justin Jones. The fact that other people can doesn't diminish that other people do. And then he says, I could probably become a great pianist if I put in the time/energy, but that doesn't take away from people that are, just because I have potential. I think that's such a good way of looking at this. Like, there is infinite ways for success and infinite people that can be successful in this hobby. It's about making it, again, like what works for you. It's about doing what you enjoy, doing the hobby in a way that brings you happiness. And I think most importantly, enjoying the hobby in a way that has longevity. So, not diving in and buying your whole wish list in 1 week. I think with all things, and especially in this hobby, the joy should come from the growing and the experimenting, not the buying. This person says, to me, it's about observation. Even after years, I continue to learn by observing my plants, adapting my conditions. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. I think it's always about researching, learning, improving. But at the same time, spending enough time with any growing or medium that you actually truly understand what the shortcomings are and how to improve that in the next version. This one says, if you have good growing conditions, you become a good grower. Is that the hot take here? I think the conditions matter less than the individual doing the growing. As a grower, it's about knowing how to compensate for the shortcomings of your conditions, and the conditions matter less than that. Oh, this one's spicy. I think what makes someone appear to be a good grower on social media may be different than someone actually being a good grower. And I don't know, I feel like I'm pretty guilty of that. I generally don't post on Instagram. I don't post post plants that are struggling, but I feel like I try to share my plant struggles on the stories. And I definitely do that here on YouTube. I don't really only show my good stuff and hide the bad stuff. If I hid the bad stuff, I wouldn't have such good, I wouldn't have easy content to share how I'm improving. So I think if anything, the mess ups are the most fun because you get to learn and improve and iterate upon your past techniques. Are you a good grower if your plants grow really fast? Okay, so this is all under Nick Cook's comment. From my observations, a lot of people that seem to grow plants quickly have more leaves with blemishes or imperfections. Like, I mean, are you a good grower if your plants have perfect shape and beautiful color? From my observations, these plants may not be growing the fastest. And then like and then he's like, you know, if the grower has ugly leaves, why would they be showing them on social media? I think that's like a good point. I feel like I feel like I brought this up a few times. Some of my plants could be darker if I move them into lower light, but for me, I want to find the intersection of speed and appearance. So when it comes to the amount of light I give. And it's going to be different for every plant, and that's something that you figure out based off of observations of your plant. Are you a good grower if you breed a lot of Anthurium? Yeah, I think these are all really good questions and points he's making. If you're breeding, you do obviously have large, healthy plants, but I know a lot of people who like nearly kill or do kill their Anthurium after they harvest a seed batch. So to me personally, that's probably an indicator that you could be feeding your plants a little bit differently. But you know, if that's not what you enjoy, then again, I don't care. It's not my plant. Do what you want. And then this is exactly how I feel. What he says is, I'm going to just quote this, "At the end of the day, I think it mostly matters what each individual grower's goals are, and try not to compare yourself to others, especially when all we're presented online is the most perfect, beautiful foliage." I think that's like such a good way to word it. I think a good grower is someone who gives a shit about their plants, respects them as living species, and is always willing to learn more about how to best care for them. 100%. No one is better than anyone at anything. The only thing that differentiates one person from another is experience. I think generally that's good. That's a good point. I think everyone can learn to grow Anthurium perfectly well. You know, you might not be able to sniff out root rot like a bloodhound or some of these other things that some growers can do, but I think everyone can become a great grower just using their senses. I hope people recognize tags like elite collector and best in class breeding are just fluff marketing ploys to get you to overspend on a seedling. It always makes me cringe. It's a little bit spicy. I mean, I don't disagree. I think if your plants have best in class breeding, it'll be apparent from the appearance and from your reputation. I don't know definitely like be aware of marketing terms. And I think when you're purchasing seedlings from hybrids, really understand what is and what is not a recessive trait. And that if it's recessive, it means it's very unlikely to show up in the offspring. So if you're dead set on something like a spider veins, which tend to be a very recessive trait, that's the sort of thing, those are the sort of plants you want to purchase divisions of specimens that you like the appearance of. Or you need to get a bunch of seedlings and play the gambling game. Like, just look at the Black Widows that were coming out from Doc Block and Rare Plant Fairy, and how very few had the Black Widow appearance. June says, "I think a good grower is mostly someone who keeps trying and who learns about their plant, its real needs, and who's ready to adjust to make their plant thrive in their own specific environment and conditions." Yeah, totally agree. Hasib says, "Growing is an art more than a science. What makes a good grower? Good relative growth and minimal effort to sustain it. I will gladly look up to and copy anyone who's growing faster than me with less effort." I think that's a really good piece of advice. Like, you know, I remember like looking at Hakuna LaPlanta's massive philodendrons, and he was at that point using the general hydroponics. And I think that's what like ultimately convinced me to give passive hydroponics a go, was just seeing him get to like experiment and push more of, the grow or whatever. I think it was on his McDowell, and I was like, damn, my McDowell is pathetic and tiny. I should try what he's doing, because his plants are, bigger. He has the same plant as me, and it's bigger, and he lives in the same country as me. So let's figure out how to, achieve those results. And once you sort of get dip your toe in the water, then it's about building it in a way that works for you. Okay, and then his next part is, a lot of people, including me, are just guessing what optimal conditions mean in terms of, I believe this means foot candles, temps, hours, light, I'm assuming, FERT, reverse osmosis water, the exhaust for your tent, silica, nutrients, semi-hydro, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, I mean, it's all guess and check, right? I can't interview God and ask him how to give, like, what exactly these Anthurium need. All I can do is play around and try and figure it out. Paul Marcellini says, a good grower is someone who is attentive, researches their plants to have a good starting point of what conditions to provide, and then figures out the best ways to provide those conditions, and then put in the work to stay on top of everything. It's definitely easier to be a good grower of less plants, so maybe that's a trait too. A good grower knows when to stop, so they have 20 healthy plants and not 100 meh ones. That's a really good point that no one else has added. I think that is like perfectly, that is such a good point. If you have more plants than you can keep up with, your plants are going to go downhill. And I feel like if you have too few plants, you're going to over nitpick, over prop, whatever, and your plants are going to go downhill. So it's about finding, that right number of plants for you, that you have, enough plant chores that you stay entertained without so much that you get overwhelmed. Paying attention and adjusting makes a good grower. Experimenting with conditions, mixes, feeding. Knowledge is the basis, but consistency is the key. Totally. Yeah, like the most basic example, this is all still quoting from Paul, like the most basic example of needing some knowledge is a wilted plant. It could be underwatered, it could be overwatered. Yeah, if you don't know, you might have rotted roots. You would keep watering thinking it's thirsty. I think it's like, does this mean you have no roots, or does this mean you need water? It's I feel like that sort of feel you get comes with killing a lot of plants to root rot. Then he talks a little bit about his other stuff. This person said, to me, being a good grower is like cooking. The more time and love you can put into it, it should be reflected in the plant health to an extent. Just like you don't need expensive ingredients to make good food, it's just the same for growing my plants. I'm not here for the competitive vibes. It's a hobby, not a sport. So just worry about your collection, but of course take inspiration and advice from other people who seem to have happy plants. That's from Maya Sullivan. I like the analogy of cooking. Like, you really don't need the expensive ingredient to get 80-90% of the results. Really, it's about choosing where to invest your time, your money, your effort. But at the same time, if there is maybe like you've been hesitating getting tree fern. Paul's point here, I feel that someone's success in this hobby is overwhelmingly dictated by the financial resources they have available to spend on it. People who can access the best quality plants through their money as well as social connections are given an undeniable huge leg up on others when it comes to producing attractive and vigorous offspring. Having the funds and space for a tent or a greenhouse puts you miles ahead of someone growing on a shelf in their living room. Tree fern, orchiata, bark, and pond can make a huge difference for a lot of people as far as how content a plant is, and they're incredibly expensive compared to alternatives. I think certain breeding practices will dictate a better quality plant, i.e. someone who chooses to work with and release a small amount of their best seedlings is going to produce overall better plants than a bigger grower who doesn't call or barely calls and stalls everything. Yeah, I think like the way I like to think about money in this hobby is it accelerates the outcome. Like I'd say I got my start selling plants by like selling philodendron props just on Facebook locally. And that was before I was getting into Anthurium. And I just did that, because when I buy a philodendron, I'd put it on a moss pole and, I'd have all these cuts off my moss pole. And that really gave me the ability to begin investing in these more expensive plants because, when you're buying a multi-$100 plant with like your actual money, it hurts a lot more than when you do a plant purge. You sell $300 of philodendron and then you buy a $300 Anthurium. It feels like you're not using your real money, so to speak. So I totally agree that if you have the financial resources, you can jump in as deep as you want in this hobby. But yeah, and obviously when it comes to producing attractive and vigorous offspring, it's totally dependent on the quality of the mother stock. There's so many ways to enjoy this hobby, and there's so many affordable, great quality Anthurium out there that you can have a beautiful collection without going off the deep end in terms of prices. And then Brian Mitchell talks about how longevity in the hobby is a sign of a good grower to him, and what he talks about is like sustainable success. I think it's a good thing. I feel like if you've been in the hobby for a few years, you see how many people come and go, and very few people are hanging around for any extended period of time. So, and he brings up the point about respecting people who've spent decades in the hobby, because it means they've kept this up through, tragedy or when life gets in the way. And I think that's a really important thing. I'm very fortunate that I share this hobby with my partner. So the two of us are taking care of these plants. So it makes it a lot easier to stay on top of care. Jono says, as a gardener, I'm guided by one simple overarching goal, which is for my plants to do well because of me, not in spite of me. And I think that's where we're going to end it here, because that's the last comment I'm seeing on this thread. Yeah, I mean, if my plants are struggling because of me, I've been known to prop a plant to death. I've been known to do some stuff I shouldn't. It certainly feels better when your plants are doing well because of you, especially when you bring back a plant or a rehab from the grave. I think that's like the most wonderful, feeling in this hobby, is turning something like ugly with potential into something beautiful because of your care and intervention. And I think that about concludes this video. I really appreciate you guys sticking through here to the end. I think it's so fun getting to read other people's, thoughts and feelings on this hobby. And, I feel like there's some spicy takes in there, but overall, I think pretty much I agree with like all of what was said. So, thank you guys for watching. Bye now.